I'm supposed to talk about, can the patient-physician relationship be saved? And if you get your newspapers in your room, USA Today, here's a question for you. Can this government be fixed? Which is kind of in the category of questions I learned from AAPS members to be, is there a right way to do the wrong thing? Can the Affordable Care Act be fixed? Can the ICD-10 coding system be fixed? Can Medicare be fixed? Maybe we're asking the wrong question. But the question of whether the patient-physician relationship can be saved is in the same category of question as can American medicine be saved, or maybe even can Western civilization be saved? And if you want some insight on that, I'd recommend a book by Mark Stein, S-T-E-Y-N, who's become one of my favorite commentators. You can recognize him by his Australian accent. At the end of America's got a picture of a corpse with a toe tag labeled Uncle Sam on the front, and he previously wrote a book called America Alone, with a lot of insight into this. And the phrasing of the question, can the patient-physician relationship be saved, reminds me of some magazines that used to be in my house when I was very small. I think it was either the Ladies' Home Journal or the Red Book that always had an article in it entitled, Can This Marriage Be Saved? Can you imagine an article about that these days? I mean, maybe we should figure out how to dissolve them more quickly, or what is marriage anyway? In 1980, only 6% of men reached the age of 40 without being married. And in 2010, that was 17%. In 1970, 69% of 25-year-old men were married. And in 2000, only 33%. Well, this could be a disaster if you've read Rudyard Kipling's book, The Just So Stories, about the role of women in civilization. I mean, we're the civilizing influence. The cave woman tells caveman to wipe his feet before he comes into the cave. So I think with all of these men being uncivilized, that's a problem. But anyway, who needs marriage these days? 40% of American babies are born out of wedlock. That's 70% for Black American babies, and 70% for white non-Hispanic women who make less than $20,000 a year. You see, men are becoming not only uncivilized, but superfluous. And the government is taking over in this as well as in the patient-physician relationship. You know, there's something to be said about these natural, long-standing traditional relationships. They're transgenerational, and they're stable. Marriage was always a way of transmitting life, your genes, your faith, your language, your skills, your traditions, your culture, and your property. But they're also a threat to the authorities and the powers that be and the New World Order. There are various organizations that have tried to do away with these stable natural relationships, including slave owners that used to sell their slaves down the river, communists who tried to get children to rat on their parents, and all of these utopian reformers who want to do away with any threats to the state's authority or any other source of loyalty, be it the family, which is probably the strongest one, the Blut und Boden, as the Germans would say, blood and relationships to the land that people stand for. We want to fragment that so that we can have a new world order. And the patient-physician relationship is another thing that has to go, and in fact, it's already on its way out. I believe I've even heard some of those ads on television about drugs. Instead of saying, ask your doctor whether that's right for you, ask your healthcare provider whether it's right for you. You know, oh, this drug, oh, may damage your liver, you know, along with some, you know, lilting music in the background. Ask your healthcare provider about that. Or you know, changing the language is the first thing towards changing these things. There are many, many ways of undermining the patient-physician relationship. Nowadays, patients more often than not are choosing their doctor, not because they like the doctor, but because his name is on the list of preferred providers. He's in the network, and if you don't see that doctor, well, your insurance is not going to pay for it. The electronic health records are both a cause and sort of an effect of this whole thing. It seems to me that if you know your patient, you know him by name, you've taken care of his mother, and you'll maybe take care of his children, then do you really need an electronic health record? Things are already in your memory. If the computer is down that day, chances are it won't be a disaster, and you can go along just fine. But on the other hand, if you have to look at the name tag or the barcode to even find out who the guy is, I suggest an electronic health record isn't even going to help you that much, because it'll be in there what other people have chosen to enter, even if assuming they're accurate, and the patient has become sort of a form of virtual reality, a digitized electronic record. We hear a lot about our fragmented medical system. I would say the problem is not the fragmentation. They're trying to turn the medical system into a giant monolith. The problem is the fragmentation of the patient. He's going to be just an example of a certain ethnic group, a certain language group, a certain socioeconomic group, and certain outcomes that we can sort of slice and dice to see whether he's meeting our requirements. And coming along with this is maybe the ultimate, the Accountable Care Organization created by Obamacare, which some people have said is just managed care on steroids, but maybe it's even a whole lot worse. If you look at how these things are to be structured, it's an organization. I guess there has to be a group like physicians or hospitals that will set up the Accountable Care Organization, but the members, the patients, they don't even know whether they're a member of an ACO, or if they're a member, they don't even know which one they belong to, because they're going to be assigned retrospectively by some bureaucrat who will just put them in a group, and it may even change from one year to another. And the doctors and patients are supposed to be responsible for the people who are in their group without knowing who they are. What kind of responsibility is that? Well, the only incentive will be that you have to treat everybody just alike. So much for individual relationships. The patient might as well be a barcode. So who's going to be doing these things? The rules are so complicated, and they are so threatening. You may have seen some of David McCaleb's, if you're on his his email list, about all of the problems with ACOs, that no group in its right mind is going to set one up because they're so great a risk. So doctors' groups probably aren't going to do it. Hospitals probably aren't going to do it, but United Health, they, with their many subsidiary groups such as Optum, they're getting ready to be the Accountable Care Organization. You know, they were a big player on the Hillary task force, a big player in probably the formulation of Obamacare, and they're buying up doctors' practices and figuring out ways to get around little inconvenient laws about the corporate practice of medicine. So this is what we seem to be faced with these days. Well, there's some, spiritual values involved here and about duty and responsibility, but ultimately, a lot of it is about money. And the root of the evil here, I think, is third-party payment, which is not to be confused with insurance. Insurance is a voluntary way of people getting together and contractually deciding to share risk. And if a catastrophe strikes you, well, then you pay for the damages, but you get reimbursed according to the terms of the contract with the third party. It used to be that State Farm didn't pay the body shop. That's beginning to change too, which is very bad for body shops and for car owners. But now what's happening is it was so convenient and so easy and so compassionate for the patient not to have to worry about the bill while he's sick, that we're going to have the third-party payer pay the doctor directly. And I would say on that day began lies, which Leo Tolstoy said in a somewhat different context, but I think it's really pretty similar and applies here, that as soon as there is the third-party payer between the doctor and the patient who's paying directly for it, the doctor really is working for the third-party payer. And there's a new controller, a new supervisor. There's an incentive for larceny, because, you know, the doctor and patient, the doctor wants to make more money, the patient doesn't want to pay. So there you have it. And there's dishonesty, because nobody knows exactly what the price. Ralph Weber and I were talking the other night about just how much change would occur in the medical system if we just had honest accounting, if people just knew how much things cost and were ready to pay it. We're already seeing a little example of this in Oklahoma City, where one of our longstanding members, Keith Smith, has the Surgery Center of Oklahoma City, that surgery center, OK.com, which had this real innovation of just posting the prices, upfront, honest, all-inclusive prices. Turns out about 20% of what the hospitals are charging. And this has been revolutionary. Then sometimes patients have started to ask the hospitals what they charge, and by golly, the hospitals can figure it out. It's kind of the same thing as Dr. Smith charged. You know, just posting the prices has a kind of a magical effect, because it reintroduces honesty and introduces responsibility. About the only thing that I learned about money, or that was discussed about money when I was in medical school, was on the psychiatry rotation, where we were taught that paying the bill is part of the therapy. If a patient doesn't pay the bill, chances are he's not going to get well. And it seems to me that over the course of practicing internal medicine, it becomes more and more apparent that this is true. And even in a more lowlier part of medical care, like physical therapy. Physical therapists these days, they go through a certain routine of what's prescribed by the doctor, and they do a certain number of treatments, and when the insurance runs out, guess what? Patient doesn't need physical therapy anymore. I don't mean to say any disrespect for physical therapists. I think a lot of them do a good job, but I saw what happened with my father, for example. He had trouble getting up if he had fallen down, and so the physical therapist were going to teach him how to stand up from the floor. Well, he got about 2 lessons and wasn't able to learn how to do that. So that gave up. But I know a policewoman, a former policewoman who had a gunshot wound to her cervical cord, who was in a wheelchair for years. She can walk, she can get herself up off the floor after spending 2 years with a fitness trainer. Not a physical therapist, not certified, not credentialed, not bound by a certain set routine, and who gets paid by the individual patient. I know a 34-year-old man who had several strokes, who was really in terrible shape, in a wheelchair, unable to do almost anything. He saw his neurologist, and the neurologist thought some sort of miracle had occurred, because physical therapy had given up on him, and he could do a lot of things now. Why? Because he works at it with a trainer who is not constrained by the insurance. And this trainer said to me one day, you know, it's too bad we're not covered by insurance. It's because more people could benefit from our services. And I said, oh, you've got it all wrong. Just like, you know, chiropractors and dentists and other acupuncturists and people say, oh, we just need a code for our services so that we can get paid by the third parties and then more patients could benefit. Well, it may mean that fewer patients could benefit, or maybe no patients could benefit, because you could no longer do what you're doing. And because, once again, paying the bill is part of the treatment. You don't pay a trainer $60 an hour to go to the gym and slag off. You work, you expect him to work, and chances are you will get better. So I think we need to restore the direct payment. And you know, some patients can't afford to pay, and we give them charity, but if you give them charity, there's still a sense of obligation, and many of these patients will want to somehow pay back at some point, if not to you, then maybe by passing on your good works to somebody else. Or a lot of times, poor people, I found, wanted to pay something for their services, and some of the things that I got from them were a lot more valuable than money. For example, one lady rebound a lot of my old books. Man, for bookbinding, that was worth a whole lot more than what Medicare would have paid, even if I'd been gaming the system and charging the most. So we really need to, the only way we're going to restore the patient-physician responsibility is to restore the mutual sense of obligation and responsibility that comes when the patients pay their own bills. And they can make whatever other arrangements they want to help pay those bills. Sometimes insurance is the best way, but I would say often it's just the most expensive way. So that when we're talking about how can we get everybody insured, we're really asking the wrong question. One of the things we're doing in Arizona to try to, I think you'll probably learn from Dr. Eck what she's doing in New Jersey, and we're trying to educate our own legislature about that, is that we run, at a minimum, 10 to 15% of every medical dollar through some third party, even for the most trivial, routine expenses. We're adding a 10 to 15% overhead. Why? When we're worried about going bankrupt and worried about people being able to pay the bill, do we want to add this overhead inevitably on top of every expense? It's not that the medical loss ratio of 80% or would be better than what we have now. We have to ask 85% of what? If 10 to 15% of the $1 trillion that's going through the medical system is going to the hands of these third party, that is a big chunk of money. Well, the Stein solution to the problems that we have with America all start with a D, and I think they all apply to medicine as well. They're decentralize. The exact opposite, of course, of what Obamacare is trying to do. De-governmentalize, demonopolize, deregulate, decomplicate, decredentialize, disentitle, denormalize. Make it seem abnormal what all of these people are doing. We need to create a condition in which it becomes impossible for the wrong people to do the wrong things. Where even if we elect the wrong guy to office, he doesn't have the power to mess things up the way things are happening now. And then most importantly, do. Two-letter word, D-O. Just do it. It's a whole lot harder than it used to be. You know, in 1920, Frederick Banting had an idea of how to isolate insulin. In 1923, 3 years later, Eli Lilly was selling insulin to American druggists. Oh, how unsafe could that be? Only 3 years. But just think of how many people were no longer dropping dead from diabetic coma because insulin was under it. So that's part of deregulating. There are many constraints on what we can do, but many of them are tied to taking that third-party payment. I hope sometime during this meeting, Dr. Huntoon will tell you this wonderful story that he just told us. He was driving down the road close to his home in upstate New York when he had to stop because there was a pig in the middle of the road. So the call had to go out to the neighborhood, including the police, and how to get this errant pig back into his pigsty. Apparently the electric fence was down and the pig had wandered off, as pigs tend to do. Well, one smart lady figured out how to get the pig back in the pigsty. She offered him a chocolate bar. And I think that's what's happening to a lot of independent doctors. They're being offered the chocolate bar, the enticement, the incentive of the third-party payment. And they're going to get locked into the cage afterward because of that. So the first thing we have to do if we're going to escape a lot of these regulations is to not take the bait of the third-party payment. One of the most exciting things about AAPS meetings is you will meet a lot of people here who really are doing it. They're doing things that were supposed to be impossible. It's supposed to be a miracle for a doctor to be able to escape from this and still be able to make a living and enjoy practicing medicine the way he used to do it. So get to know each other, get to know who these people are, and then if you're not already doing it, please go home and follow their example and come back and tell us what you learned from your experience and show us a better way to do it also. So thank you very much. Enjoy the meeting.